So thank you all for coming. And let's see, can everyone see my screen? Should be sharing. Give me a thumbs up. Yes, all right, very good. All right, so this is the 2025 Arizona Federal Lands Access Program webinar for you guys on the Federal Land Management Agency side. Just a quick intro from me. So my name is Andrew Valdez, and I'm the planning team lead at Federal Highways, Central Federal Lands. But I did actually start my career many years ago on the federal lands side, actually both with the Forest Service there in Sabino Canyon. I took this photo, and also with Fish and Wildlife. So I've been in your shoes, and I'm here to kind of help you through the process. We slotted a couple of hours for today. I've only got about 30 slides to go to, so I think maybe the demonstration will go about an hour, maybe a little less, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after I'm done. Just a couple of housekeeping items and disclaimers, legal mumbo jumbo that I got to read before we begin. Except for the statutes and regulations cited, the contents of this presentation do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the states or the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide information regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on a public website. I started the recording after you all said hi. This webinar, as I said, is geared mostly towards you guys on the federal land management side. Yesterday, we did host a webinar for prospective applicants. These are the local government agencies that own and manage the access roads and other facilities people use to travel to federal lands. I mentioned this because we do want to see the FLMAs and local governments collaborate on applications. And we do try to find those projects, that are obviously mutually beneficial, right? And I'll get into more of the mechanics of all of that later in the presentation. Just note also that application materials have been posted on the Arizona FLAP webpage since about the beginning of the month. So those are all available and ready for download. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the webpage, we'll also go over all that. And then, unless otherwise noted, Federal Highways and Adobe stock images used under license are the sources for all the images in the presentation. And then finally, the slide deck has been added to the meeting invite, and I'm also posted on the website. But if you got any trouble, just reach out and I can shoot you a copy. Okay, so this is our general outline for today. This might be review for some of you, but for others, this could be, brand new information. So we'll start with first an intro, who is Federal Land Highways, who we are, what we do, and then we'll move on to a full rundown of the access program or the FLAP, basically A to Z. So you'll be a FLAP expert by the end of this. And then we'll get into the elements of just the application packet that you guys have to be familiar with on the land management side. And then we'll close out with call timeline, some general housekeeping, and then, like I said, plenty of time for Q&A at the end. All right, so Federal Lands Highways. Basically, we're the Department of Transportation for you all in the federal land management world. As I'm sure many of you are aware, about a third of the United States is owned and managed by the federal government. In our office, plans, designs, and builds transportation infrastructure within and leading to federal lands. And we have different programs for each, which I'll talk about in a minute. We do function much like a DOT in that we deliver most of our projects, although we don't own or maintain any assets. The rest of the federal highways is under the federal aid system, where funding goes to the individual states, and there's FHWA division offices that have sort of a stewardship and oversight role with the state DOTs and other local agencies. So for federal lands highways, we try to capture our mission there in the mission statement. And this is where Central Federal Lands, my office, sits within the broader Department of Transportation. So as I said, we're a division office of federal land highways. And again, we serve the land management agencies. So for us, you all on the FLMA side are kind of like our primary clients, our primary partners. And, we really do exist to provide access to the traveling public while helping you support your land management objectives. And this map just shows how the country is split up into different federal lands regions. So there's, central, eastern, and western. So once again, I'm in central, and our division office is in Lakewood, Colorado. This is where I sit. And our territory basically includes all the states between California to North Dakota to Texas and everything in between, including the great state of Arizona. These are our core capital programs. So today we're mostly going to be talking about the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP, and then to a lesser extent, the Federal Lands Transportation Program, or FLTP, and how those are kind of set up to work together and sort of different sides of the same coin. These two projects, or these two programs, are set up to address access to and within federal lands. And the easiest way to think about this is FLTP is generally for federally owned transportation systems, and FLAP is non-federally owned, but provides access to public federal lands. FLAP projects are programmed through a call for projects, which we opened for Arizona earlier this month. And the owner of the facility, or the agency that maintains the facility, has to be the primary applicant. So typically this is like a state DOT or a county or sometimes a municipality. But the ownership for FLAP eligibility has to be non-federal. And if it is federal, the local agency must agree to assume maintenance responsibility. So in the case of like a federally owned route, like a forest highway, we'd want to see something like a maintenance agreement between the local agency and the FLMA. And I'll get into eligibility more in a minute here. FLTP is programmed by you guys, the FLMAs themselves. And we actually don't have much visibility into that process. We just deliver the projects for you guys. And we also have programs for federally recognized tribes and emergency federal relief, the TTP and ERFO, but we aren't going to spend too much time talking about those today. So just a little bit more about Central. We have those 14 Western states I showed you on the map, and some Pacific territories, including Hawaii. And we're not just about moving people from A to B. Our federal lands are some of the nation's treasures, and the built environment, and infrastructure needs to take into account things like visitor experience, resource conservation, and federal lands highways is really at the forefront of delivering these context-sensitive projects like that. Federal lands highways roads serve recreational travel and tourism, protect and enhance natural resources, provide sustained economic development in rural areas, and provide needed transportation access for tribal communities. And overall, we provide funding for more than 90,000 miles of federally owned and public authority owned roads which serve federal lands. Okay, so that's federal lands highways. Moving on to the access program. So this is a program that's authorized by Congress in national transportation legislation. So first in MAP 21 back in 2012, and it's been continued through every transportation bill through our current one, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or EJA. EJA authorized around $300 million per year of its life for the access program, 2022, and then it expires at the end of fiscal 2026. And FLAP's purpose is to improve non-federal transportation facilities that provide access to, are adjacent to, or sometimes located within federal lands, with an emphasis on high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators. which we'll get into a little bit later. Okay, so we will start with eligibility. So per the legislation, any public highway, road, bridge, trailhead, or transit system located on or adjacent to federal lands is eligible. And improvement activities include rehabilitation, restoration, new construction or reconstruction, engineering and environmental compliance, and operation and maintenance of transit facilities, and also planning and research. But again, title or maintenance responsibility must be vested with the state, county, or local government or a tribal government. So the non-federal facility owner, again, is the primary applicant for the access program. Or if it's a federally owned FLMA route, it can be eligible if the local agency consents, again, to maintain the facility through a formal agreement. And we can provide examples of those kinds of agreements if needed. There were some changes to FLAP under EJA. There did used to be a local match requirement. Now the match or leverage funds is optional, but it can help in certain situations, which I'll get into in a minute here. And now there's also expanded eligibility for what are called context-sensitive solutions. So these are projects that preserve aesthetic, scenic, historic, or environmental resources. So think of like a raised boardwalk over a wetland or an aquatic organism passage over a stream, for example. And there's also eligibility now for signage, wayfinding, landscaping, and other visual mitigations. So typically those elements by themselves wouldn't be very competitive in a FLAP application. We'd want to see the primary component, be a transportation improvement, but now they can be included and kind of rolled into a larger project package. All right, so just to make it clear, we'll run through some kind of common eligibility scenarios on the map of Rocky Mountain National Park here in green. So at the top, you've got a road or maybe a trail that starts outside the federal lands and ends somewhere inside the unit boundaries. The locally owned segment and the federally owned segment, all of that alignment could be eligible if the local agency, again, agrees to assume maintenance responsibility for the federally owned portion, that blue segment there. And this sometimes happens when there's a county or a town that uses the road for secondary purposes, like say emergency access, or the road leads to some sort of municipal facility, like a treatment plant or something like that. Second one down is kind of the most straightforward scenario. You've got a locally owned road, starts outside the federal lands and ends at the federal lands boundary, like at a trailhead or a parking lot or a fee station or something like that. If the trailhead or parking lot is locally owned and maintained, all of those facilities could be eligible in an application. And then there at the bottom, you've got a road or facility starts outside the federal lands and then in short of the boundary that would be eligible as long as the road or trail or whatever eventually does lead to an access portal or federal lands. Typically, we wouldn't want to, fund a project that's any further than like 10 miles from a fedland boundary or entrance, but it doesn't have to actually touch federal lands to be eligible. And just, in general, the further away you are from federal lands, the less competitive an application is likely to be. Tribal roads maintained by a local tribe are also eligible, but the facility must still access federal lands other than just the tribe. So tribal lands are not eligible destinations in and of themselves. So for the access program, tribal entities are treated more like a state DOT or a county than an FLMA. And then finally, land leased to the federal government is not eligible, it must be federally owned. This is another scenario that we see sometimes, and I think might be relevant in Arizona. So you can have a state park surrounding a reservoir that's managed by the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. Roads or even water facilities like docks or marinas and things, anything leading to the water within the park could be eligible as long as they're not federally maintained. And that's an opportunity for leverage funds to be proposed in an application. Say if like the state park is already planning some transportation improvements to the site, all of those improvements could be bundled together into one application for us to deliver, or the state park could just request flat funds and then use those to supplement the project that they're doing. So that's eligibility. Of course, there are some like edge cases and odd projects and things that might not fit exactly the mold. So, I'm your resource for this, and I'm happy to talk through kind of the nuances of any specific project that you might have in mind. We can pull up Google Earth and kind of walk through the ins and outs and details of your project offline. So moving on to funding. So FLAP is allocated by a legislative formula, and this hasn't changed since MAP 21. Essentially, it's a function of the percentage of federal lands within a state and the federal public roadway mileage by state. So this is how it shakes out on a national basis. Unsurprisingly, Western states are favored in this program. Arizona is one of our bigger programs with about 42% federal landmass, and that gives the state about an annual allocation of about $11 million per year. That's not a ton of money, in the transportation world, but if we're talking, unpaved roads, trails, natural surface trailheads, planning projects, and leveraged opportunities with partners, that funding does start to go a little farther. We also want to flag, we'll typically program anywhere from 2 to 4 years of funding in any one call. So in this call, we could be talking, upwards of $44 million worth of projects for Arizona. Okay, so on to funds leveraging. We don't use proposed leverage funds as a scoping or a scoring criteria. But to the extent that applicants can bring additional resources to the table, we can kind of expand the program in the state and deliver more projects. And here's just sort of a rundown of eligible leverage funding sources. This is mostly an FYI for you guys on the land management side. But as I mentioned earlier, FLTP funds can be used as leverage or overmatch to deliver one larger project. So for example, if one of you is aware of an FLTP project, but the need actually extends beyond, the federal boundaries, it would make sense to bundle those projects into one package for us to design and deliver. There's significant savings when we can do things like that, and we do love to see those. So here's a little more on the FLAP, FLTP leverage angle. As I said, again, these programs can be bundled. There are some conditions. The Programming Decisions Committee, or PDC, and FLMA concur on the project, and I'll talk a little bit more about the PDC later. Obviously, we want to see the projects be, contiguous or at least adjacent to each other. And then the project has to be managed as one delivery package so that we can realize those economies of scale. In certain instances, the PDC may also require the local agency to contribute funding, but this is sort of figured out on a case-by-case basis. And this is just a graphic example of how a joint FLTP, FLAP project, could work. So say you've got a flat project to improve a county road to the entrance of a national forest, the blue segment there, and then separately there's an FLTP project to improve a scenic drive to the parking area, the alignment you see in red. Those projects could be combined in a FLAP application. And this has, benefits really to all parties. The applicant can have a low or no cost burden. They can have us design and deliver the project, and then they get to claim an overmatch, leverage funds on the application. And again, this is also great for us because it'll be much cheaper to deliver one larger project than to try to mobilize for two smaller projects separated by a period of years. So my ask to you guys on the FLMA side, get with your area or regional transportation program managers to see if there's any possibilities like this in the pipeline for your units. And again, if you don't know who to talk to, let me know and I can get you connected to the right folks. On project delivery, this is kind of another FYI for you guys, but as I mentioned, CFL typically leads and delivers the selected projects. And the application, the applicant will indicate this on the application itself. That's because this is really our business model. We are project funded and we have performance metrics that we have to meet. There are some exceptions to this, like major highways or transit projects, but they are kind of rare. And again, this is mainly just an FYI. The takeaway here is that we typically deliver the programs as opposed to like a state DOT or other local agency. And it's a kind of a federal to federal relationship between us and you guys on the land management side. Okay, so who makes the programming decisions? Each state has a programming decisions committee or PDC. This is a three-person volunteer board that's established by a charter and made up of a state DOT rep, a local government rep, and then our office, Federal Highways, has one seat. And you can see the PDC responsibilities there on the slide, but essentially it's their job to ensure proper stewardship of the program from a statewide perspective. They're not advocating for special projects in their districts or anything like that. Now, what you don't see here is FLMA representation on the PDC. Each state has an FLMA technical advisory group or tag. Some of the folks on this call are part of our tag for Arizona. And they advise the PDC, but they don't actually have a vote when it comes to shortlisting projects. Unfortunately, transportation funding for FLAP is, a fixed amount per state. And as much as we'd like to do all the projects, of course we can't. So we don't want to deadlock the PDCs. So for the access program, we do defer to the agencies that own and maintain the facilities to make the final decisions. All that being said, the feedback from the tags is hugely important in deliberations. So FLMAs do play really a critical role in programming and decision making. Okay, so moving on to preferred projects. So preferences given to transportation facilities providing access to high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators. So that's actually like written in the legislation. Federal recreation is defined as any site used by the public to recreate on federal lands, so pretty straightforward. High use is defined for like a region or local area and not compared across the state or the entire country. So, not every county has the Grand Canyon, for example. And federal economic generators are defined as any use of or on federal lands that increases aggregate investment or economic activity for a local community and or region. So, think like a ski area, sometimes energy production sites, destinations that have a regional or national draw, major employment centers, but the underlying ownership does have to be federal. We did just fund a big project in Washoe County, Nevada that provides access to Black Rock City and the Burning Man Festival. The PDC saw that as a major economic generator and ended up picking that one out of a pretty competitive batch of applications. And all that happens on the BLM lands up there in northern Nevada. And these are the kinds of projects that we like to see, starting with full reconstruction or rehabilitation of a roadway. Anything that expands modal access to a federal unit, like a new bike lane or a new multi-use path. Wholesale bridge replacements, safety enhancements, things like new access portals or trailheads, parking lot improvements are also good projects because they'll expand or enhance access. Obviously, a lot of this is a judgment call, but if we see a reasonable scope realistic project estimate and strong FLMA coordination and support, the project will be in alignment with the FLAP vision, and that's going to be a pretty strong application. We also love to see partnerships. I think partnerships take a project from good to great. When multiple agencies work together on an application, I think this can help leverage funds and local knowledge and addresses projects of mutual interest and greatest need. Sometimes, we have complicated projects that require a coalition of local champions to get them moving and funded. So the more partners at the table, sometimes the more resilient a project is going to be. And, just to keep in mind, like our only goal is to service the partners and deliver quality projects that the public and public agencies want. So broad coalitions are always a good sign. We don't have really a dog in this fight. We're here to deliver good projects, and the more partners want a project, the stronger the application generally is going to be. Moving on to projects that we don't love to see. We don't typically do maintenance-only projects. The purpose of the program is to expand access, not patch up something that maybe has some underlying major issues or address a county's deferred maintenance backlog. So, chip seals, mill and overlays, things like that. We also want to do a complete project. We don't want to do a project where like an underlying issue or problem isn't addressed. So say if like a road has an outdated design or poor subgrade, and those elements aren't addressed in the application, that would typically weaken the project. I always like to say, make sure you pick logical termini. We wouldn't want to, build a 4-lane road that ends at a 1-lane bridge. That's an extreme example, but that's an example. Unclear, poorly written applications, obviously. So if you guys on the land management side are working with a county on an application, it helps to provide them with photos, maps, whatever context they need to be able to clearly communicate the purpose and need for the project. It's always helpful. Of course, the project must meet the eligibility criteria. And again, we always want to see good coordination between the locals and the FLMAs. Believe it or not, we do sometimes get applications where there was no coordination with the FLMAs. Sometimes we see applications that seem more like urban or rural commuter routes or neighborhood streets. And then the federal lands access component is, tangential or a minority of daily usage. Those kinds of projects can be eligible, but in cases like those, we typically want to see commiserate matching funds since the access component is secondary to commuter or other local purposes. Okay, so we're going to hop into the application and the application process here. So the links you see at the top of the slide take you to the main FLAP landing page and to the Arizona page. And you'll see a map of the US and other info about the access program. As you can see, Arizona is currently green, which means the process is open and we're accepting applications. Generally, call for projects is open, around 3 months. And we try to schedule calls, as I was saying, every 2 to 3, 4 years, depending on funding eligibility, our resources, and other projects that we're doing in the state. And the reason why we do it that way, as opposed to like a yearly call, is we don't want our programming decisions to be constrained by the size of a program's FLAP allocation. That's kind of an artificial number. Really what we want to do is just establish a quality multi-year program of projects, and doing it every 2 to 4 years gives us that flexibility. Hey, so for the application itself, again, we do encourage you guys to work with the applicants, but your only actual responsibility is to fill out this 1-page FLMA support form. So not too onerous for you guys. Couple of things I do want to point out. If the project does, kind of impact more than one land management agency, we would want each FLMA to submit a form. So lots of times national parks are like embedded into a forest or BLM lands, we would want to see both. Fill out this form. Box 11 is important. This is where the PDC will see how the applicants coordinated with you all in developing the scope of the project. So, is this a bridge to nowhere, or is this like a local project that's not really important to you guys? Or is this something that really helps you guys out? So this is your opportunity to sell the project from your perspective. And then box 12 is to indicate if FLTP funds will be used anywhere near the proposed FLAP project. So reminder, talk with your regional transportation coordinators to see if there's any of those in the pipeline that line up with needs on the local access system. We do also encourage letters of support. So, if there's some friends groups or advocacy organizations that do want to submit a letter, those are fine. Those can just be, submitted along with the rest of the application package. And this is our timeline for Arizona. So we'll have the call for projects open for about 3 months, as I was saying, from September 1st to the end of November. We're targeting to have our deliberative process complete by February of next year, so that we can have a shortlist meeting sometime in the spring, summer timeframe. We're giving ourselves a generous amount of time to complete scoping. So, just because sometimes we have to work around winter weather and our scoping engineers do have to get eyes on the projects. But I think at the very latest, we could expect to have scoping on shortlist projects complete by the summer of 26. And that would put a final programming meeting sometime in the fall. And if all that stays on track, that would give us construction, implementation, sometime in the 28, 29 timeframe. But a lot of that can move around, can be project dependent, so don't hold me to that timeframe. Finally, just to wrap up, a few last items. We can loan borrow between states within a transportation bill. As I said, EJA expires at the end of 26, so it doesn't really apply to this call in Arizona. But for future reference, if we get a multi-year bill, you can sort of swing for the fences and ask for a larger dollar amounts in multi-year transportation bills. On end-of-year specifics, really the only takeaway for you guys here is that we do aim for over 95% obligation rate year to year. So we are trying to get these projects programmed and dollars on the ground. I'll be your flat point of contact for this call and through the short list of projects. So, feel free to reach out to me at any time throughout the process. Again, I'm happy to talk through the specifics of a project you might not be totally sure is eligible or is a good fit for the programming, for the program. And you can see the programming contacts there. These are the folks that will take over from me after a short list of projects is agreed upon. So for Central, your contact would there be Jill Locken, and her and my contact info is on the last slide. And as I mentioned, this whole presentation is on the meeting website and will be available shortly on the Arizona FLAP webpage. And I guess I would just say in closing, if one of you knows about a good project, reach out to the locals. I think what we see a lot of times is that county engineers or public works, folks at the counties and towns and things don't really have great visibility into what your needs are, your access needs are. And sometimes they're more focused on the high volume, commuter routes and things like that. So, just pick up the phone and have that conversation, and you might find out that you've got kind of a good alignment of needs, and a FLAP application, really makes a lot of sense. That's kind of why this program was created, to kind of fill that niche. We did host a webinar yesterday for the applicants, and it was pretty well attended. I think we had about 30 or 35 people. So I think there's quite a bit of interest in the program in Arizona for this round. So you all might start hearing from people in the coming weeks and months. And that's really about it. yeah, we're looking forward to some great projects in Arizona, and happy to hang on as long as needed to answer questions. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, you bet. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I appreciate the presentation. If the current FLAP funding expires at the end of 2026, is a project that's been selected, can that continue to move forward beyond 2026?
I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, okay.